The roguelike genre has been something that has been a thing that I've enjoyed for quite some time now. It's one of the few genres where dying in the grand scheme of things is not that big of a deal unless you're at the end of a run. Well, that is a different story. But since the days of the traditional titles like NetHack and Angband, or recent titles like Hades, Dead Cells, and The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, we've gotten titles that are challenging and unforgiving, but also really fun to play. Roguelike or roguelite games offer some of the highest counts of replayability in any genre. The randomized nature of the enemies, the level layouts, and the item pickups and the gameplay mean that each and every playthrough is always going to be different from each other. The biggest possible roadblock that they do have though is of course permadeath. Dying is one thing in a game, but losing a save and having to start all over again is something else entirely. Some games like the recent Doom entries or Outlast have difficulties like this where if you die you have to start all over again. I've managed to complete the insane difficulty in the first Outlast and the DLC, as well as Ultra Nightmare in Doom 2016. I've yet to do it in Doom Eternal, but I will at some point. Sometimes though, it can be incredibly deflating when it happens, when you die that is, especially at the end of a run or when you're in the final boss stage, and you have to start all over again just because you made one little mistake that ended up killing you. In roguelikes or roguelite games, you'll be consistently going through this feeling over and over again, and it changes up every time, so you don't ever really have a chance to practice a level like in, say, the Doom games or, say, Outlast, where each level is static. So it becomes more about understanding the mechanics of your character, the gameplay loop, the items, and how you deal with each enemy. Of course though, some roguelikes like Tales of Magiel do have other modes that enable lives and saves, but the most thrilling experiences comes from the fact that you have the one life left, and that each decision could ultimately be your last. Dying is also part of the progression too, because each run yields new unlocks and items that will make the next run easier, and one game that makes it abundantly clear that dying is the first step forward is Risk of Rain. Risk of Rain is a 2D platformer roguelike released in 2013, and as of the 8th of November, which is its initial release date, it'll be 10 years old. It was made by Hapoo Games and published by Chucklefish, made with the Game Maker engine. It's a game with a variety of enemies, characters to play, tons of items to discover and unlock, and a deep level of replayability to be had. Risk of Rain had got its start from two college students, Duncan Drummond and Paul Morse. They shared ideas together and decided to pull their resources into a project under the name Hapoo Games. The crux of their development of the game was on the founding pillars that are the platformer and the roguelike genres. They've worked together really well in the past, as you could see with games like Dead Cells or Rogue Legacy and Spelunky. Using Game Maker, they would eventually develop Risk of Rain, but originally the game that we have now was not at all what they had originally intended. Risk of Rain was to be a tower defense game that would scale its enemy difficulty in distance. More on the scaling part later, but the actual application of their idea within a tower defense gameplay loop proved to be more complicated, so they eventually reviewed the concept and morphed it into a 2D platformer where the player is always moving anyway, and that's what the game would be, a 2D platformer with roguelike elements. The game itself is set in a sci-fi setting where our cargo ship, the UES Contact Light, gets sabotaged by an unknown being, causing it to crash onto a planet called Petrichor 5, where the survivors end up being stranded. Our goal is to get to the ship and repair it, and it's our only hope of escaping. Of course though, it's easier said than done, and there's a couple of reasons why. Your first starting character is the Commando, who has a pretty simple tool set, and introduces you to the gameplay loop and mechanics of Risk of Rain. To get to the next level, you have to find the next teleporter, wait for the timer, clear the enemies, and then repeat the process until you reach the final stage. It sounds really simple, but it really isn't. You have two things to factor in, the difficulty and the timer. The game is quite hard, even on the drizzle difficulty. You have levels, but they don't mean that much on their own, because what will make the bigger difference are the items that you obtain. Throughout your runs, and I mean that in plural, you'll be finding items that you'll stack together that give off a variety of different effects, but collectively they make your character an overpowered monster. The more items you have, the better. Without them, you're pretty much fucked. Some have managed to beat the game without using any items, even on Monsoon difficulty, which I would not recommend on your first time playthrough, but that's something you shouldn't do on your first run anyways. So the loop consists of killing enemies, getting gold and XP, opening chests, gambling on the statues in the hope of items, buying more items, fighting the teleporter, killing the boss and other enemies, and then repeating it all over again in the next level. And it's a lot of fun. There are a bunch of other characters that you can unlock, but they each have different requirements for them to unlock, and some require dumb luck, like Huntress for instance. You need 15 monster logs, and that can take forever because they don't always spawn when you kill enemies. I've yet to unlock them all, but that's only a matter of time. and a lot of grinding too, I might add. They all have different playstyles and abilities, some that make the game a lot easier to beat than say other characters. The game itself though can be beaten with just about any character. Like I said though, you need a good combination of items stacked together to help carry you through the final level, and having drones is always a bonus, on top of understanding your character's movements and mechanics. Then the second part, and probably the most important part of your playthrough, is the timer itself. The game's most unique aspect is the difficulty scaling system indicated by the timer. Basically, the longer your playthrough goes on for, the harder your run becomes. The 3 difficulty modes all have permadeath, but they each handle their timer differently. Drizzle allows you to take a slower pace, but it doesn't save your progress. Rainstorm is the middle of the road, and you have less time before it spikes up in difficulty. And Monsoon, only play this mode if you really know what you're doing. It starts off with very easy, but as time goes on, it will then progress to the higher difficulties, and the final one is where it gets pretty insane. The enemies also scale in health and damage too, as well as the bosses, and on the higher difficulties, other enemies and bosses also appear, so the pressure gets worse as you continue the run. You can play on whichever difficulty, but if you play long enough, it ends up being the same anyway, aside from damage output, health regen, and also the timer on the teleporter too, which is longer on the Monsoon difficulty. The game is quite addictive and in a good way as well. Each run only encourages you to keep playing it again and again, experimenting with different characters as you unlock them, different item builds, or hell, even see if you can beat the game without using any items for that matter. It's a game with a great deal of depth in terms of difficulty too, because of how it scales over time, like I already said. The controls for the game itself also handle really well for mouse and keyboard. Normally I play platformers with a controller, but the layout for the keyboard made it so that I didn't really have to. Movement between each character feels simple and intuitive. The abilities are also pretty easy to pull off, where the mouse never really has to be used. Environments are nice and varied, and each run will sometimes give you a different one, along with slightly altered layouts. The music is also really well done and memorable. Some of the tracks hit at the right moments, and the final room has a very somber and bittersweet element that ties into the secret story of the game itself. The composer, Chris Christodoulou, did a fantastic job in creating a unique soundtrack that ties the game together, in the same way that the rug tied the room together, and I would highly recommend that you give the soundtrack a listen. The premise makes it a lot simpler than it actually is, but when you read the monster logs, it gives you more insight into what's actually going on, and it does change your perspective on what's happening, the role of your characters, as well as the consequences of your actions. The story gets fleshed out a lot more in the sequel, but the game has a solid foundation even for something that retrospectively feels more like a proof of concept. A proof of concept that can last you hundreds of hours alone, maybe thousands on just the vanilla experience alone. When I had beaten the final boss, it was an incredible feeling. To have only the one life and still come out on top is one of the most invigorating feelings I've ever felt in gaming. I felt it when I beat Doom 2016 on Ultra Nightmare, or winning my first Battle Royale match, or beating Melania with a sliver of health. It's things like that that make roguelikes amazing, where your choices actually matter because of what's at stake. And even if the worst happens, you always come back for more anyway, because the next run will be more interesting and unique, and plus you'll also have that experience from the previous run. Roguelike games are on the top when it comes to replayability because of what they provide, and this game here is no exception. I still have so much to do in terms of finding logs, unlocking characters, beating other bosses, doing a monsoon run, the list goes on. The game gives you so much if you're willing to grind for it. You can also find artifacts that can shake things up and even make the game a lot easier, like the artifact of glass or the artifact of command. I had managed my first completed run with glass. It makes you a glass cannon, which means you have very little health, but you deal a shit ton of damage. But as long as you can evade the attacks and stack items, you become stupidly overpowered, especially with the infusion item where your health increases with each kill. There is also co-op online and local that I hadn't managed to get into so far because of issues regarding the loading times or just not finding a session, but it is there if you have people to play with. Even on solo though, the game is still insanely fun, and even more so with other players that are also into roguelike games. Speaking of the vanilla experience, what's there is already quite extensive. There's also the modding scene of the game, however. Risk of Rain 2 already has a plethora of mods made for it, but so does the first one. There are a ton of modifiers, add-ons, and overhauls. The most prominent overhaul being Starstorm, which is basically Risk of Rain 1 on steroids. It adds a bunch of new characters, items, enemies, artifacts, levels, and even a new difficulty mode. It basically builds upon what is already there, giving the game even more replayability, which is the best thing that mods can do. But I would implore you to play the vanilla game first, so that you can appreciate what the mods bring to the table. The game is turning 10 years old, and it's still one of the best roguelikes out there on the market today. It's overshadowed by its sequel, which I have yet to play but really want to. The first game, however, is still worth playing, has a ton of content and mods, a fun gameplay loop with a variety of enemies and characters with different playstyles, and the experience on its own is quite short, made even longer with all the ridiculous builds that you can obtain alongside the scaling difficulty that adds more challenge. There is a remastered version of the game coming out presumably, and I'll definitely play it if it does. But for now, enjoy the original while it's still available. You will get more than your money's worth if a 2D roguelike is what you're looking for. Definitely play the first Risk of Rain. Thank you for watching.